What we need is a regulatory strategy that's more nimble. And I sometimes call it a regulation that promotes leashes on the technology. Something like if you think about other intelligent entities, taking your dog for a walk, you put it on a leash, right? Well, that's flexible. It allows the dog to explore the neighborhood and so forth. But there is some degree of oversight and connection with humans.
Welcome, everyone, to the AI Governance Podcast, where we discuss practical approaches for responsible AI practitioners. My name is Shankar, and today we're excited to have with us Cary Coglianese. Cary is the Edward B. Shils Professor of Law at the University of Pennsylvania, the director of the Penn Program on Regulation, and a global expert on models of regulation. So welcome, Cary, and thanks for joining us to chat AI policy.
Great to be here, Var. Thanks for having me.
So here we are in late January. We have President Trump back in office, and he's promised a lighter touch approach to AI regulation. And we've also seen recently the release of an open source high-performing Chinese model in DeepSeek R1. And there's kind of an active discussion about how that model was trained using chips that were not at the cutting edge and in an exponentially cheaper way, and questions around whether the Biden administration's approach of maintaining American dominance through a combination of export controls and limits on advanced model access was a good one. Though, of course, it's hard to say, what kinds of Chinese models we'd be seeing without those limits. So it kind of strikes me as a great example of the regulation gap, which is, by the time regulators acted on deep learning, we already had generative AI. By the time we got some consensus on generative AI, we already had agentic models. And now we're dealing with this kind of new open source type of model. So I'm wondering if you can share some of the ways that we might want to think about addressing this regulation gap.
Well, listen, it's the reality. So, I mean, we can wish it away, but I think there was a time when people thought, oh, we should put in place a 6-month moratorium on AI research. Or that was a quaint moment in time, wasn't it? But always a futile effort, really. And I do think, though, you're right to point out that the challenge is to find regulatory strategies that can kind of keep pace with the changes in the technology. And by the way, at the outset here, I think it's important to be clear that when we're talking about artificial intelligence, first of all, it's not a technology in the singular sense. It's a broad range of technologies. It's not only across the board a range of technologies, but it's also something, as you suggest, that's transforming rapidly. It's dynamic going forward. So there are regulatory strategies that have been used in other contexts that can apply under these conditions of what we call heterogeneity. That is, differences both cross-sectionally today, how there's many different types of AI tools out there, and they're being applied in many different systems and lots of other larger components of larger technologies and systems. But then it's also rapidly advancing. And what regulators in these other contexts, admittedly not identical, but they have been able to try to put in place requirements to be flexible, be agile, and be vigilant, where we can keep human oversight on the advances that are happening. And that's really, I think, going forward, the basic formula that I would say we have to be thinking about um, is flexibility, agility, and vigilance. And I'm happy to talk about some of the ways to think about regulation, um, with those principles in mind. I think we sometimes think about regulation as a very firm, fixed, rigid rules, and I think that's sort of the popular uh, uh, notion that people have when they think about regulation. They think about something very constraining. And we see this actually replicated in the discourse around AI governance as well. Uh, Everybody wants guardrails, right? Uh, well, what is a guardrail? It's something fixed and rigid on a well-defined path or roadway, and it keeps people on there and protects them and so forth. Well, that's the wrong metaphor here to be thinking about, um, because we don't even know really where the roads are to demarcate the edges of it where we might put guardrails. And a guardrail is a kind of a passive device that's protective, right? Because it just is there. But what we need is a regulatory strategy that's more nimble. And I sometimes call it a regulation that promotes leashes on the technology. Something like if you think about other intelligent entities, taking your dog for a walk, you put it on a leash, right? Well, that's flexible. It allows the dog to explore the neighborhood and so forth. Um, but there is some degree of oversight and connection with humans there, despite that flexibility. And the biggest, and I think most prominent example of a regulatory strategy that meets this vision is what I would call management-based regulation. It's actually being used to protect all of us from the harms of pathogens in the food supply system. There's just so many different sources of entry of pathogens into what we eat, so many different types of food. They come from different sources. Even years ago, even when the Food and Drug Administration put in place a regulation for the safety of fruit juices. So if anybody's got kids around, they're drinking fruit juices, you want to make sure that they're safe, right? Well, it turns out that there's no two fruit juice manufacturers in the United States that have the same manufacturing process. So extreme heterogeneity. How do you regulate in those situations where a regulator you can't meet the gap. You can't go in every facility for fruit juices. And of course, in the artificial intelligence sphere, we're just not going to have regulators be able to be on top of every move that's happening in the industry. But what we do is we put in place requirements for risk management systems, and companies that are using or in developing AI can be expected um, to meet standards for overall risk management, that having those humans at the end of the leash on the technology.
I really like the leash analogy, and also I'm a proponent of a kind of strong AI assurance ecosystem with clear roles and responsibilities. In total agreement there. I will say, just bringing it back to the U.S. regulatory concept or context, we have seen the way that we would typically set something like this up is you would have a federal law, and then you would have an agency that's kind of interpreting it in real time and kind of responding to the latest developments, right? So both with a new administration that's a little bit less enthusiastic, let's say, about administrative law generally, and then also having no federal regulation for comprehensive regulation for AI in the U.S. What are some of the ways that, like, I guess, putting aside what the administration will do and what the government will do, in an ideal world, what would be desirable in the US at the federal level for us to have this kind of assurance and management based kind of oversight in place?
Sure. Well, one thing I would say is, um, and this may run a little counter to what uh, seems to again be the at times the zeitgeist in the world of AI governance is that I don't think we really should be looking for a single comprehensive AI regulator or regulatory body. Why? Well, again, because of this extreme heterogeneity of AI and because the risks associated with those various forms of AI arise in distinct use contexts. So, and it's really when AI is applied in specific uses that they pose risks. And we want to make sure that there's expertise about those use contexts that are brought to bear in regulating AI. So, uh, we want a Food and Drug Administration to be thinking about um, AI in medical devices. We want the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to be charged with and thinking about and issuing standards for AI in automobiles. And, go on down the list. Now, there may be some gaps once we do that where we don't have sufficient regulatory coverage right now, maybe in social media, maybe with certain large language models, there is a need for filling some missing gaps between these agencies, or there may be some common issues that arise where there could be a benefit for some kind of across the board, a kind of like an NTSB in transportation that studies problems, issues recommendations across the board. I do think you will find, though, even within these specific domains, there will be a mix of regulations, or that would be the ideal. Some of those will be of the more prescriptive kind. So if AI uh, is powering an automatic braking system in automobiles, well, that those that there's going to be a performance standard that system has to meet, just as if it were human based as well. But that said, there will always, I think, be a need for this overlay of a management based framework across all sorts of different domains where developers need to be responsible for a plan, do, check, act kind of framework where they are expected to try to identify potential risks, develop methods for robustly testing and validating and verifying their AI tools, for having feedback loops and user inputs so that when problems arise, they can make adjustments and modifications. These are all, though, management components because they involve sort of internal practices, planning, and procedures within a company that's developing and applying AI. And that would be an approach I think you would see even with respect to medical devices and even with respect to automobiles and so forth.
Yeah, and it sounds a bit like where we were kind of headed, maybe before the change in administration with the AI Safety Institute kind of developing subject matter expertise in cutting edge models, and then sharing that with other federal agencies that have kind of sector specific guidance. Um,
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I mean, I think the popular conception, by the way, is that Europe was way ahead of the US when it came to AI governance. But actually, if you looked across the federal government, there were dozens upon dozens of guidance documents, risk management frameworks that different agencies had been developing. Those are still there. I don't know what the status of those will be uh, in this new administration. I think, the likelihood is that they may be or rolled back. I mean, many of them were not mandatory. Okay, so um, maybe it won't be a priority to rescind those. And also if the first Trump administration is any guide, they the president did sign several executive orders calling for the development of trustworthy AI. The President Trump signed those. President Biden retained those. Now, they weren't as robust and comprehensive as the executive order that President Biden had adopted for AI governance, and that President Trump has now rescinded. But they are an indication that, and I think even in the industry, there's recognition that if the industry is not careful about developing these tools in a responsible manner, even as they're blazing forward with very rapid development of new models and the like, they still have to do it responsibly because, some major catastrophe is going to pose the risk of backlash, public backlash against AI, and maybe prompt ultimately even a Trump administration to go along with legislation that might be much more clunky and prescriptive than is probably appropriate. And we do have a history over the course of regulation of different types of technologies that when there's a crisis, a catastrophe that occurs, the public pressure on legislators is so great to do something. And what they sometimes do in those moments of crisis is something that's really not very feasible or sensible. And so I think the best thing, the wisest course for the industry is to make sure that those big catastrophes don't happen. You don't have those focusing events. And, listen, that's better for society. It's better for the industry, or industries, quite frankly, again, because it's such a multiplicitous suite of technologies.
Great. So I think, you're right. In the AI policy community, we definitely often hear the EU AI Act referred to as kind of the gold standard. But increasingly that view that, a sector specific approach that's really focused on use cases is, you even hear that from the European policy community. We wish we'd spend a bit more time kind of thinking about the different regulatory models, and maybe a sector specific approach. So we now have three kind of models of AI regulation around the world. We have the U.S. approach, which we've discussed, which is kind of light touch at the federal level, and then states kind of toying with the idea of more comprehensive AI laws, but only Colorado so far having done so. In the EU, we have a comprehensive, of course, horizontal AI law. And then in China, we have a focus on tracking major algorithms, labeling generative AI content, combating deepfakes, and then really more of a focus on kind of the values that are expressed by AI-based recommenders. Um, so I guess those are the three kind of main models. Uh, And then we have a fourth group that says, we don't really know what's happening, so try to do as little as possible, see how things kind of shake out, and take the best ideas emerging from different communities. I'm wondering, do you have a favorite among these models, and what lessons can we? What's just taking stock of them? What lessons can we draw?
Well, I think it's a little early to draw lessons, right? Because even the EU law, which we've been saying many people see as the first and the most comprehensive legislative or regulatory package, its provisions haven't really fully taken effect just yet. And even when they do, it's time will sort of tell a little bit about, and a lot will depend also on how any of these models and frameworks get implemented. A lot will depend on how well resourced the governmental entities are that provide oversight. So one can have, maybe on paper the most ideal system, but if it's the law in reality and the law in practice doesn't live up to the law on the books, well, then those books can gather dust, or maybe now it's electrons, uh, and not be very meaningful. So, so I do think that implementation matters, and I do think it's a little hard to say lessons. But I but I think in the U.S. it's very clear that uh, we are shifting from a regulatory model that if I thought about it on a spectrum again, thinking about these set of technologies as intelligent, okay, you could think about them as how you might treat a horse. A horse could be kept in the barn, right? And not out, or the horses could run wild, as some of them are in some parts of the mountains out west. You can still see some packs of wild horses, right? Um, or you can be somewhere in the middle where you have some way of tethering humans and guiding where those these intelligent technologies are going. I think we were somewhere in the U.S. sort of in the middle. I think the EU is in the middle there. China may be a little, perhaps closer to the wild and free, perhaps than Europe, and maybe we were positioning ourselves somewhere in between. But uh, you know, I, I think we're going to see going forward under the Trump administration a much greater shift to let the horses run wild, and that is not probably the best thing for the overall industry, if thinking about the highly varied nature of what this means, even to call it an industry. But I think we need to think about ways of keeping it tethered and ensuring that there's responsible oversight. And and unfortunately, we're going to cede, I think, not only um, the the risk of, as you mentioned earlier, with the developments in China, some of the technological advancements, but the experience that would be gained from learning how to regulate and govern these technologies in a responsible manner, with perhaps a lighter touch. I think that could be uh, a realistic approach even for the Trump administration. But I hasten to say that um, I don't see that this administration yet will likely view kindly any kind of regulation in this space.
Great. So that's I know we're almost at time here.
Sure.
I did want to ask you because you also teach, what advice you would have for a first year law student as they navigate this educational and legal landscape that is rapidly changing because of AI.
Yeah, I would say, maybe for a first year law student, I wouldn't worry too much about um, relying on AI. I would, think about um, training your model. That is, really, the humans are algorithmic in many respects. Of course, the artificial intelligence technology is often, at least metaphorically, modeled on neurons and the way the human brain is structured. We also, in studying law is itself algorithmic and has all sorts of rules and properties. And I think becoming really well trained yourself is going to be very, very important. Uh, AI is going to transform the legal profession in, I think, some significant ways, but there will always be need for the human creativity to be able to solve the kinds of problems that these tools, will not re- uh, probably ever be able to replicate. Some of that may be in the realm of, by the way, softer skills. So a lot of what we do in law schools is the hard analytic training, but unlike maybe medical schools have learned over the years to help doctors need to learn a little bit of bedside manner. You know, we're going to have to think about ways that even lawyers might need to make sure their human skills in negotiation, communication, and empathy are also in place. Again, I don't know that that makes a huge difference in the first year of law school, but I do think in the second and third year, those would be skills to gain. And then also skills in learning how to prompt and work with collaboratively some of these AI tools. I will say I've tried them out myself. Right now, they are um, useful in many different contexts, and lots of firms are using AI tools for document processing. E-discovery's been around for now quite a number of years. It uses natural language processing. They're less successful right now at actual reasoning through especially novel problems. They're performing well on the bar exam. It's just amazing. From Chat GPT version 3.0, failing the uniform bar exam at the 10% level, and then just about 3 or 4 months later, Chat GPT version 4 coming out and passing the uniform bar exam at the 90th percentile. There's going to be rapid change, keeping on top of that change, learning to work collaboratively with these tools, I think will be a part of an overall legal education, even if it might not be the top priority in year one.
Great. Well, Cary, I know many of us have benefited enormously from your decades of work on regulation. So thank you for that. And also thank you for making the time to join us on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
And with that, we'll wrap up this episode of the AI Governance Podcast. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and we'll see you next time.